July 1776 was not just another protest season. Something larger was taking shape. The colonies were preparing to speak in a new voice. For years, the colonies had argued with Britain. Now they were preparing to justify a final break. That matters, because the Declaration was not written as reckless rebellion. It was written as a grave public argument. It did not claim that all authority was evil. It claimed that authority had limits, and that British rule had crossed them. The Declaration spoke of equality. It spoke of rights. It spoke of government by consent. It spoke of a people who may alter or abolish rule that becomes destructive of those ends. And then it did something more. It turned theory into accusation. A long train of abuses, a bill of injuries, a case for separation. But the Declaration did not land on blank ground. It landed in minds already shaped by rival colonial worlds. That is why the same words did not mean exactly the same thing everywhere. The document was shared, the hearing was not. In New England, the Declaration sounded like moral principle made public. These were people already trained to hear politics in the language of duty, corruption, and righteous resistance. When the Declaration spoke of rights, New England heard more than private claims. It heard public obligation, a people defending rightful self-government against corrupt power. When it spoke of equality, New England heard moral seriousness. When it spoke of consent, New England heard covenant turned political. And when it listed abuses, New England heard proof. The theory had become evidence. The grievance had become a public case. That is why the Declaration fit New England so naturally. It sounded like principle, accusation, and duty all at once. In the South, the hearing was different. The Cavaliers and their heirs did not live in the same civic world as New England, but they recognized the language of violated rights immediately. When the Declaration spoke of rights, they heard property, land, honor, local control, a distant power crossing into a world it had no right to command so closely. When it spoke of government by consent, they heard the defense of a ruling world that believed local authority should remain local. The Declaration did not erase hierarchy there, but it gave hierarchy's defenders a language for saying that even established authority has limits when power becomes remote and unjust. Then there were the Quakers, and here the Declaration becomes more morally complicated. The Quakers could recognize coercion. They could recognize grievance. They could recognize injustice in power that no longer respected conscience or restraint. So when the Declaration spoke of injury, they heard something true. When it spoke of rights, they heard a moral claim they could not dismiss easily. But the Quakers also heard something harder. This was not merely a statement of rights, it was the prelude to war. That is what makes their hearing so important. They could hear the justice of the claim without finding peace in the path that followed from it. When the Declaration spoke of alter or abolish, New England heard duty. The frontier might hear defiance, but Quakers heard the terrible burden of what such a sentence would require. That does not make the Quaker hearing weaker. It makes it deeper. They remind us that just claims do not erase moral cost. So the Declaration reached Pennsylvania not as a simple call to celebration. It arrived as a moral reckoning. In the Dutch commercial world, the hearing shifted again. Less sermon, less hierarchy, more civic and commercial liberty. This was a plural city, a practical city, a city used to exchange, administration, bargaining, and self-direction. So when the Declaration spoke of rights, New York heard not only natural justice, it also heard civic autonomy, the right of a society to direct its own affairs without suffocating outside interference. When it spoke of abuses, the Dutch-descended world heard pressure on commerce, institutions, and the practical life of a city that had long learned how to make difference livable. The Declaration gave that world a rights language broad enough to include contracts, trade, civic order, and local self-direction without reducing everything to profit alone. That matters because New York did not hear the document as a village heard it. It heard it as a city. On the frontier, the Declaration sounded different again. The Scots-Irish had long been conditioned to distrust distant rule. So when the Declaration spoke of rights, they heard confirmation. When it spoke of unjust power, they heard recognition. When it spoke of legitimacy broken, they heard the truth of an old suspicion. These were people already used to power-making decisions from safer places, already used to distance, neglect, and rule without shared risk. So the Declaration did not have to persuade them that distant power could become unjust. It told them that their instinct had been right. When it spoke of the right to alter or abolish, The frontier heard one of the hardest lines in the document with unusual clarity. Government exists to secure rights. When it no longer does, its claim weakens. That is why the frontier hearing mattered so much. The declaration gave moral and political form to instincts the borderlands had already been living. And so one document began to travel. Through New England towns, through Virginia estates, through Pennsylvania streets, through New York docks, through the backcountry. The words were the same, but the hearing was not. New England heard moral duty and violated self-government. The South heard rights, land, and local control. The Quakers heard conscience under the burden of conflict. New York heard civic and commercial liberty. The frontier heard distant power finally named as unjust. That is why the Declaration mattered so profoundly. It did not make the colonies the same. It gave them a common vocabulary, a common language of rights, a common language of grievance, a common language of legitimacy, a common language of separation. That was enough to justify joint action, but it was not enough to erase the rival inheritances beneath it. The Declaration did not create one culture. It gave rival cultures their first shared political voice. That is why this document still towers over the American story. Not only because it announced independence, but because it taught rival Americas how to speak together before they had fully learned how to live together. The Declaration was the first common language of rival Americas, and that is why it could speak to 5 different Americas at once. For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.